as usual, there's more questions than answers right now. When will inflation actually get down to the Fed's goal of 2%? Will the Fed decide to cut rates 25 or 50 basis points or not at all in September? Is the labor market alarm bells something far worse than just a warning? When will I get out of this garage? As usual, there are more questions than answers. And so my big question that I want to talk about today is, how do we fix the economy? To do that, I sat down with two people.
So I am the chair of the President Biden's Council of Economic Advisors. And actually what we do here is very much what's in the title. We advise the president and the senior staff on what's going on in the economy.
That's Jared Bernstein, chair of the Council of Economic Advisors and one of the people tasked with dictating the direction of the economy. I sat down with him to talk about where the economy is at and where it could be going.
I'm deputy director of the National Economic Council.
Okay.
And so our job at the National Economic Council is to try to coordinate the economic policy across the administration, make sure that the president has the best possible information on the economy when he's making decisions, and make sure we're all coordinated.
That's Daniel from the National Economic Council. We talked specifically about housing because that's something the government is heavily focused on right now. Basically, they're making it easier to build, which we'll talk about later.
Build, baby, build is really important to us.
But I began the conversation by asking about what's on everyone's mind.
Inflation.
On August 14th, we got some inflation data. We got the CPI report, the Consumer Price Index, which tells us where inflation is headed. On August 13th, we got the PPI, another inflation indicator, the Producer Price Index, and both of those data points are promising. The CPI showed that a lot of the inflation was driven by housing costs, something that is not going away for whatever reason. And there's a whole video to be made about the confusing part of housing data and how that influences inflation in a very confusing manner. The PPI pointed to slowing inflation, the CPI was the same story. But as Joe Weisenthal pointed out, we can actually look at other CPIs. The UK CPI is slowing down. Inflation was a global issue, and the fact that other economies outside of the US are starting to experience disinflation is good. We also got the New York Fed's latest survey of consumer expectations, showing that the public's outlook for inflation is slowing too. People are not expecting that much inflation, which is good. But delinquency expectations did increase. So the overall inflation story is promising, but the road is windy and we've been on it for a long time. And while what we saw in the recent report is promising, as Jared says,
so what we follow is trends. But that report showed actual price declines in some areas that people care a lot about.
And there was a lot of good news in this report. We saw the lowest level of overall inflation since March 2021. We saw low gains in grocery prices. We saw low gains in energy. We saw decreases in prices for airlines, car rental, toys, and used cars. And so the inflation story is abating in a really big way, and policymakers have been paying very close attention to that. And of course, there's still continued conversation about what caused this inflation. And are the causes going away? Corporate pricing power is part of the story too.
Our FTC, our Federal Trade Commission, has been extremely active in this space. So is our DOJ. We're just seeing a lot more concentration and a lot less competition than we think is consistent with, free markets and market forces. So this is kind of good old Econ 101. So those policies are really important to have a level of competition wherein elevated markups, elevated profitability comes back down. And that is a great way, by the way, to pay for non-inflationary wage gains. If you think about the economy sort of as labor share of income and capital or corporate share of income, those shares can be in contention. And when labor has inadequate bargaining power, it tends to lose share and profit shares can go up. And that's a source of inflation. So we can achieve disinflation or non-inflationary wage gains through diminished markups, through lower profit shares.
But the inflation story has also had components of the price elasticity of demand. People keep buying stuff even though the prices have been increasing.
There's an old saying, I like old sayings when they're true, and this one is true. The cure for high prices is high prices. But that wasn't the case for a while because this price elasticity of demand, it's a fancy way of saying consumers' responsiveness to high prices, wasn't really in function. It is coming back. You're actually seeing companies saying this now. You have Walmart, Pepsi, and Amazon, and Target. They're all saying we're going to lower prices. But another piece of this is the price elasticity of demand coming back online. People being, again, more responsive to high prices so that that cure can play out.
Companies raising prices and consumers not really responding or pushing back until recently is absolutely part of the inflation story. And with inflation, it's so difficult to talk about because inflation going down doesn't mean that things are all of a sudden cheap. Like, your cereal is still expensive. Rent is still expensive. A lot of people are in a lot of pain because of these high prices, which is why it's important to understand the policy that's being implemented in order to combat these high prices, to understand both the good and the bad of the policy. You can complain online all you want about the world, but it's also important to understand what we're doing to improve the world. And that's what we're focused on in this conversation. The average consumer is still heavily impacted by inflation, but we're also starting to see signs of concern from the labor market.
What we want to see right now is to maintain the tight labor market while easing inflation, because that translates into paychecks that are growing in real terms or inflation-adjusted terms, more buying power. And that's a critical input to today's economy.
There's been slowing hiring, higher unemployment, and slowing wage growth. And this is a sign of concern for policy goals, but it's something that policymakers are paying attention to.
I'm going to give you two concepts on the labor market: normalization and bathtubs. Normalization means that things get back to where they were sort of pre-pandemic in terms of a lot of the statistics of pandemic economics, which is a whole unique creature that you yourself have written about extensively. And very important, it's a big part of our analysis is understanding pandemic economics, where it starts and where it sort of stops. I mean, it's still in the current economy in many ways, but when you kind of get back to where you were, which is actually what Chair Powell recently said about the labor market, it is true that some of the dynamic, you're going to see some cooling, but what are you cooling to? Are you cooling to something that's too cool, or are you cooling to something that's sort of normal? And so far we've seen more normalization. Now, to understand the dynamics, because that's sort of the static view, think of a bathtub. So all the people in the bathtub are the stock of unemployed people. And the faucet is people coming into unemployment. So they're either losing their job or they're coming into the labor market and they can't find a job. That's the inflow. The drain is the outflow. And let's just talk about, there's different ways you can leave the bathtub, but let's just say you're leaving unemployment for a job. We're seeing people come into unemployment at about the same rate that they have, which is pretty low, which we're happy to see. We're seeing the outflow a bit diminished, so that people are spending a bit more time in unemployment than they have before, because hiring is kind of normalized, bringing these two concepts together. Hiring was way above normal. We had millions, almost 10 million at one point, vacancies. Now that's getting back down to the levels that were more associated with more normal times pre-pandemic. So the outflow is a bit diminished, but it's kind of where it ought to be at about this stage. So I think we're looking at a pretty, kind of a normalization, but also a very robust and still quite tight labor market. And one of the best indicators of that, our wages are beating prices.
But also, traditional economic thinking has been tested.
I think the way people feel about the economy, and I think it takes economists a while to wrap our heads around this, we tend to think in growth rates. A lot of people tend to think in levels, by which I mean the following. We can have, and we have enjoyed, considerably slower inflation, which is super important. We won't get to where we have to go without disinflation, meaning slower inflation. It was 9%, it's now 3%. What's remarkable about that disinflation is that it's occurred while we've maintained the tight job market, because a lot of economists said, no, you have to give up the tight job market to get all that disinflation. That hasn't been the case. But what a lot of people care about are the actual levels of prices.
A drop from 3% to 9% inflation might sound like good news, but with so many aspects of economic policy, the reality is much more complex. And the distinction between rates and levels is crucial. It's like the difference between how fast you're driving and how far you've actually traveled. The speed might be slowing down, but you're still further from home than where you started. And for a lot of people, they're paying attention to levels. They're not paying attention to the inflation rate. And so what do normal people think about? And how do policymakers think about what normal people are thinking about?
How much things cost. And we've had this concept here at the CEA called your PPV, your personal price vector. But what it means is that we all carry around a list of prices in our head, which we expect them to be. Gas, as we mentioned, gas and groceries are always on the PPV, so they're among the most salient.
Basically, this is all the stuff that you buy. So I buy dog food for Moo, Jared buys...
I buy a lot of music.
And all the stuff we buy composes our personal price vector. And this personal price vector has gotten more expensive. And there are solutions being implemented to fix that.
So when it comes to costs, we've tried to do a lot to put downward pressure on healthcare costs, health coverage, prescription drugs. When it comes to airline fees, when it comes to entertainment fees, housing fees, there are rental junk fees that drive us nuts. And way more so for rent. So convenience fees, they call them convenience fees, which looks like kind of an arbitrary thing. Application fees, there's something called a January fee, which appears to happen in January and is attached to nothing other than you can send out to your client, And so we're taking action against those, and we've had considerable success.
So we have two main groups focused on economic policy, as I've discussed. We have monetary and fiscal policy. Part of the Fed's mandate is inflation, raising and lowering interest rates, managing the balance sheet in order to address that. Fiscal policy is outside of that. The fiscal policy side of the inflation fight comes through regulation and making things work better. One thing they also did was set up the supply side disruption task force to fight back the snarling of supply chains, helping to reduce prices and reducing unemployment. Basically, they were looking at the root cause of the problem and saying the supply chains are all messed up. That contributed to about 60 to 70% of inflation. And they said, we're the government, we're in charge of making the world a little bit better, so let's do that. So all this is great, right? We're talking about the inflation, we're talking about the labor market, but the biggest thing that policymakers need to tackle, in my opinion, is of course housing. I first asked Jared about demand subsidization, which is something the government is heavily criticized for. You're making it too easy for people to buy a home versus simply building more housing.
10 years in the making, we've had a supply shortfall, particularly at the bottom half of the job market. So Build Baby Build is really important to us, and we have an agenda that should add at least 2 million affordable units to the stock of housing. That would make a real dent. By some measures, that's the magnitude of the supply shortfall.
2 million new housing units. It's a number so large that it's hard to wrap your head around, but for many Americans, it comes down to a much simpler question. Will I be able to afford my rent next month?
The number one solution to the housing crisis is to quickly build more affordable housing. But even quickly in this space isn't quick enough, because we have to help people with problems that are besetting them today.
And of course, this all requires bipartisanship and congressional approval. It also requires a closer look at home insurance, something I will do in a later video. Home insurance could be a crisis within itself and actually bleed into the broader housing issue, but policymakers have a job to address the foundational problems here, which is just not enough homes and too many people that need homes.
Well, the central problem in housing right now is we don't have enough of it. We need to build more of it. And so that has been a priority of departments and agencies across the federal government. What can we do to incentivize state and local governments to reduce barriers to building? What can we do to get more federal financing flowing, including making it work better and cutting red tape?
Rents are high. They are stabilizing in some cities, but as we have talked about in numerous videos, it isn't enough.
Now, building more housing takes time. And one of the things that the president has directed his team to do is say, what can we do to help renters in the near term as we're kind of getting to that point where more supply is coming online, both because of the record number of units under construction now and because of the proposals he's put forward to build more housing.
So what is the policy solution?
So the president is announcing a 5% cap on rental increases. This also has to be legislated, but we're going to work closely to make that happen.
Rent caps are controversial to say the least. And we're going to talk about that, but here's the general idea behind it. As Jared discusses, the idea here would be for corporate landlords, those who own more than 50 apartments, capping their rents at an increase of 5% or sacrificing a lucrative tax benefit, writing off the depreciation of their real estate assets. So it's not going after mom and pop landlords. It's only meant to last about 2 years. New construction is exempted. And so they're hoping that all of that will make the existing literature on rent caps not apply. And it should keep all the incentives in place to keep on building.
Rental affordability is important for so many reasons. I think it's also important to acknowledge that renting is better for some people than buying a home, and that's okay. Another piece is substantially expanding rental assistance for the lowest income households. We know that even if we closed the gap between supply and demand in our housing market right now and built a lot more housing, there would still be some households who didn't make sufficient income in order to afford market rents. We need to substantially expand rental assistance for those households.
Since we've gotten here, there's been almost 5 million units built, and we think we're on track for another million.
Because that's what we need. Building and building all types of housing.
But that's not enough. I've talked a little bit about some of the things we're already doing in this space around helping on the cost side, but we have some pretty ambitious plans, some of which are already in play, to help on the supply side.
That ambitious plan that he's talking about is the LIHTC, the Low Income Housing Tax Credit. They have a $40 billion commitment in the budget, and this is actually favored by everybody, which is a feat within itself.
LIHTC, to which we have almost a $40 billion commitment in our budget, is a program that is favored by builders, by low-income housing advocates, and by banks. Now, it is not easy to find a program that gets those three cheering.
Builders like it because it subsidizes building. Banks like it because it lowers their tax liability. Housing advocates like it because it helps to build more affordable housing. And affordable housing is really impacted by something called the pencil out problem that Jared talked about in our interview, where it costs too much to build affordable housing. So the people that you're building it for actually can't afford it at the end of the day. It's not affordable. The people it's benefiting can't pay for it. And in a capitalistic society, if you're a home builder, you're not going to be very interested in that deal. But Jared makes a really good point here that structural affordability is a
market failure.
The issues that we have, housing, childcare, and eldercare, are supply and demand imbalances that might exist because of existing regulation, but it's mostly free market forces out of alignment.
It's another word for a structural unaffordability, a market failure. And where President Biden is always coming from is, look, if the market's failing, we have to intervene. If it's not, we stay the hell out of there, right? And that's respect market forces until they fail.
And there aren't just policy proposals around housing, there's policy proposals around childcare too.
We have great plans in our budget for both of them, where we very much fix the income that you'd have to pay for childcare at well below 10%. I believe it's 7%. So that's really important. Yeah. So right now, people can spend a third of their income on childcare.
Absolutely.
Right? And so housing can be another 40%. Okay. A third plus 40% leaves you, a quarter left, and that ain't enough. It's not enough. So we have to work to make both of those more affordable.
And wealth inequality.
One thing that comes up a lot is taxes, right? Like the American people don't necessarily love taxes, but they're really important. And you recently gave an address talking about reshaping the tax system. Can you talk about how the tax system can be designed to be a little bit more fair and some of the ideas that you had around it?
Yeah. So, this next year is going to be a really important opportunity to, I think, reshape the tax system. A lot of the provisions in the Trump tax cut from 2017 expire next year, so it'll be an opportunity for us to revisit and really correct some of the failures of that law, but also go beyond just correcting the failures of that law and really try to address some of the long-standing inefficiencies, unfairnesses in the tax code. So starting with the Trump tax cut and why that didn't work and why we need to correct it. At the time, proponents of that law said it would lead to a significant increase in business investment that would raise wages for workers and really trickle down and help everybody. We know now that really the main thing it did was explode the national debt. Yeah. It really did fail to raise wages for the middle class and lower income workers. It failed to give us the increase in growth that proponents of the legislation said it would. So we need to correct the failures of that legislation. There are also kind of long-standing inefficiencies and unfairnesses in our tax code that this is such a good opportunity to address. So I think the best example of that is that right now, people who work for a living, make most of their income from work, they every paycheck, every year, pay their taxes, and they're taxed on their income. whereas people who make most of their income from their wealth, from their investments, in many cases, they're able to not just avoid paying taxes every year, but they can, in many cases, avoid paying taxes really forever by accumulating large amounts of wealth, passing it on to heirs, and never being taxed on that. So I think this is really an opportunity for us to say, how do we reorient our tax code so it works better for lower income Americans and for the middle class? Mm-hmm. So what does that mean? It means getting rid of some of those loopholes that some of the wealthiest Americans are able to take advantage of, making sure that they are in fact paying tax when they earn, and then taking the opportunity to pass tax policies that help working people, that help the middle class, that help lower income families. Expanding the child tax credit, we know, would be a way to not just drastically cut child poverty, but to help families that are raising kids have a little bit more breathing room. We could expand the earned income tax credit, which would help low income workers who are currently in many cases actually being taxed below the poverty line, have a little bit more breathing room every month and every year. Right now, the premium tax credits that President Biden has passed should be expanded. Those actually help families lower their healthcare costs by $800 a year on average. So there are a lot of things we could do to make our tax code work better for the middle class, for lower income families, and we could pay for it fully by raising taxes on the wealthiest Americans, raising taxes on large corporations. And the reason it's important that we have a tax system that raises enough revenue and we pay for the investments that we're making is because by reducing our deficits, we can reduce the risks to our economy, we can reduce the risks of a long-term fiscal adjustment that likely really would be borne by lower income and middle income people.
I've seen the best minds of my generation minimizing their taxes rather than building libraries. And so one thing that last week taught us with the end-carry trade sell-off is that the economy is very, very global, and as much as we like to pretend otherwise, so we talked about the global economy and the role workers have in it, specifically the idea of worker-centered trade.
People are not just consumers, they're also workers. Boom. That's it. People are not just consumers, they're also workers. They live in communities where jobs matter, where dignity of jobs matter, where the anchor factory in your community matters. And if you engage in trade policy that disregards that because it means lower prices on the things they buy, because you're thinking that they're exclusively consumers, and they're not people with jobs and factories and communities, you are engaged in non-worker-centered trade.
We spoke about the role of tariffs and how flat tariffs are harmful. Tariffs are a form of soft power. If the world is globalized, cutting someone off from trade is like cutting off an artery. You destroy them. So well-placed strategic tariffs can be an effective policy tool for negotiation and getting one's way. But just slapping them on everything is a bad economic practice because it hurts people.
We know that people are both consumers and workers, so our trade policy has to be both and. It has to both respect the importance of robust trade flows to make sure the economy's supply side is amply supported. You know, trade is a really great tool of expanding any economy's supply side. But we also have to be mindful of the costs of those flows to communities who are victims to unfair trade or who don't have the resources to make sure they're properly insulated against some of those forces. And that's the both and worker-centered trade agenda that we pursue.
So throughout these two interviews, we talked about the state of inflation. We talked about the state of the labor market. We talked about the state of the housing market. We talked about trade. We talked about the policies that are being implemented to fix the issues that we're facing. I think oftentimes we get very, very wrapped up in the problems and who should solve them and how do we solve them. And the main thing is we have to have proposals. We have to have policy solutions in place. Housing is a crisis, right? And the fact that there is now a housing supply plan that's, number one, going to make it easier to build, getting rid of all the red tape, which is a whole other video within itself, the bureaucracy behind some of the policy proposals, is fantastic because this is going to streamline what it means to develop policy. It's going to streamline affordability for people. It's going to streamline how people can think of their economic future. And that's something we should all be excited about. There's a bipartisan element to this too. We all exist in the economy, and it's incredibly stratified, it's incredibly divided. But at the end of the day, we have to evaluate these policies for what they are, which is solutions to help people. Policy solutions that are being designed to help people should be the goal of everybody at the end of the day. As idealistic as it sounds, we should all want to make the world a better place. Not just for us, but for your future, for the people who come after us. And there are things being done to make the world a better place, and Build Baby Build is just one part of that.